When Alcatraz began operating as a federal penitentiary in 1934, the United States government had a very specific goal: create a prison that could not be escaped, could not be influenced, and could not be corrupted. Located on a rocky island in the cold waters of San Francisco Bay, it was physically separated from society by more than a mile of strong currents and freezing temperatures. The isolation was intentional. Authorities believed that distance itself could function as punishment. Alcatraz was not designed to hold ordinary criminals. It housed prisoners who had caused trouble in other federal institutions, men considered violent, disruptive, or impossible to control. Among them were infamous figures like Al Capone and Robert Stroud. However, despite its reputation, Alcatraz was less about physical torture and more about psychological discipline. The cells were small, approximately 5 by 9 feet, containing only a cot, a fold-down shelf that served as a desk, a sink with cold running water, and a toilet. Prisoners followed a strict daily routine. Silence was heavily enforced, particularly in the early years. Meals were eaten quietly. Movement was controlled. Any violation of rules could result in time spent in D Block, the isolation unit, where inmates were confined in even darker, colder conditions. The philosophy behind Alcatraz was control through predictability and deprivation. Privileges were minimal but structured. Inmates could earn small comforts through good behavior, reinforcing obedience. The surrounding city of San Francisco was visible from the island, a constant reminder of the freedom just beyond reach. For many prisoners, seeing the lights of the mainland at night intensified the psychological burden. Between 1934 and 1963, 36 men attempted escape. Most were captured, shot, or drowned. The most famous attempt occurred in 1962 when Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers disappeared after chiseling through ventilation grates and using handmade rafts. Officially, they are presumed drowned, though the case remains one of America's most enduring prison mysteries. Ultimately, Alcatraz closed in 1963, not because it was too brutal, but because it was too expensive to maintain. Yet its legacy endured. It became a symbol of total isolation, a place where punishment was not measured in lashes or chains, but in silence, routine, and the slow erosion of hope. For centuries, Robben Island was used as a place of banishment. But during the 20th century, under South Africa's apartheid regime, it became something far more calculated: a prison designed to break political resistance. Beginning in the 1960s, anti-apartheid activists were sent there not simply to be confined, but to be silenced, isolated, and psychologically dismantled. The most famous prisoner was Nelson Mandela, who spent 18 of his 27 years in captivity on Robben Island. He was not alone. Hundreds of political prisoners, members of the African National Congress and other resistance movements were incarcerated there. The apartheid government classified prisoners by race, and discrimination extended even inside the prison walls. Black prisoners received smaller food portions and fewer privileges than Indian or colored inmates. Cells were small and sparse. Mandela's cell measured roughly 8 by 7 feet, containing only a mat on the floor, a bucket for sanitation, and minimal personal items. Prisoners performed hard labor in a lime quarry under intense sunlight. The glare from the white limestone damaged many inmates' eyesight permanently, including Mandela's. The physical labor was exhausting, but the greater objective was psychological exhaustion, to make resistance feel pointless. Communication with the outside world was severely restricted. Prisoners were allowed only a few censored letters per year, often heavily redacted. Family visits were rare, conducted under strict supervision, and limited to short durations. Books and newspapers were controlled. Even conversations between inmates were monitored, especially in the early years. Yet Robben Island did not fully achieve its intended purpose. Instead of breaking the prisoners, it became what some later called a university of resistance. Political inmates secretly educated one another, debated ideology, and strengthened their commitment to equality. The very isolation meant to destroy their morale, sometimes deepened their unity. Robben Island stands as a powerful example of how prisons can be weaponized against political dissent. It was not merely a detention facility, it was a tool of state control, built to crush a movement. Instead, it became a symbol of endurance, proving that even in conditions designed to erase identity and hope, conviction could survive. Between 1975 and 1979, under the rule of the Khmer Rouge led by Pol Pot, Cambodia was transformed into a radical agrarian state. Cities were emptied, intellectuals targeted, and paranoia became government policy. In the middle of Phnom Penh stood a former high school that would become one of the regime's most terrifying institutions, Security Prison 21, better known as S21. Today, it is preserved as the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum. S21 was not a conventional prison. It functioned as an interrogation and extermination center. An estimated 14,000 to 20,000 people passed through its gates. Only a handful survived. Prisoners included former government officials, soldiers, intellectuals, foreign nationals, and eventually even members of the Khmer Rouge itself. The regime's internal paranoia meant that loyalty offered no protection. Upon arrival, prisoners were photographed, catalogued, and forced to provide detailed biographies. Every confession was recorded. This documentation created a chilling illusion of legality and order. Torture was systematic and methodical. Prisoners were beaten, electrocuted, deprived of sleep, and threatened with harm to their families. The goal was not truth, but confession, confirmation of imaginary plots against the regime. Cells were either tiny brick compartments where prisoners were shackled individually, or larger rooms where dozens were chained together. Silence was enforced, movement required permission, even crying out in pain could bring further punishment. Hygiene was almost non-existent, and malnutrition was common. Once a confession was extracted, prisoners were typically transported to execution sites outside the city, most infamously the killing fields of Chung Ek. There they were executed and buried in mass graves. S21 functioned as part of a larger genocidal system that resulted in the deaths of approximately 1.7 to 2 million Cambodians. What makes S21 especially disturbing is its bureaucratic precision. Torture was documented, orders were signed, records were archived. It was cruelty organized through paperwork. The system demonstrates how systems of administration, files, photographs, written confessions can be used to legitimize unimaginable violence. It stands as one of the clearest examples of how a prison can become an instrument of systematic extermination. Officially known as Penal Colony No. 6, Black Dolphin is one of Russia's most secure facilities, reserved for the country's most dangerous convicted criminals, serial killers, terrorists, and perpetrators of mass murder. Unlike historical prisons built for interrogation or political suppression, Black Dolphin represents a modern philosophy of permanent containment. Its defining characteristic is not physical torture, but the complete elimination of hope for release. Most inmates housed here are serving life sentences. Under Russian law, life prisoners may theoretically apply for parole after 25 years, but in practice, release is extraordinarily rare. For many incarcerated there, Black Dolphin is a final destination. The prison's internal regime is built around absolute control. Prisoners are blindfolded whenever they are moved through corridors. Guards bend inmates forward at the waist with hands cuffed behind their backs to prevent them from memorizing the layout of the facility. Surveillance is constant. Cameras monitor cells 24 hours a day. Even inside their cells, inmates must follow strict posture rules. They are not allowed to lie down during daytime hours and must keep their hands visible at all times. Cells typically house 2 prisoners in confined spaces with steel doors and multiple layers of bars. Conversations are monitored. Contact with the outside world is minimal and heavily regulated. Exercise occurs in enclosed yards surrounded by high walls and metal grating, offering no view beyond the prison's interior structures. The psychological weight of such confinement is immense. There is no meaningful work program aimed at reintegration because reintegration is not expected. Daily life follows a rigid schedule designed to eliminate unpredictability. The routine itself becomes a mechanism of control. Black Dolphin illustrates a modern extreme, a prison where the purpose is neither rehabilitation nor execution, but indefinite isolation from society. It reflects a penal philosophy centered on security above all else. In this environment, punishment is measured not in years served, but in the certainty that freedom may never return.
For decades, Carandiru Penitentiary stood as the largest prison complex in Latin America. Opened in 1920 in São Paulo, it was originally designed to hold around 3,000 inmates. By the early 1990s, however, the population had swelled to more than 8,000. Severe overcrowding transformed daily life into a constant struggle for space, hygiene, and survival. Cells built for a handful of men often held double or triple their intended capacity. Sanitation systems collapsed under pressure. Disease spread quickly through cramped cell blocks. Tuberculosis and HIV infections were common, worsened by limited medical care. In many areas of the prison, the state's authority weakened, and inmate gangs established internal control over daily routines, protection, and black market trade. The situation reached a breaking point on October 2, 1992. A fight between rival groups escalated into a large-scale disturbance. Military police were called in to restore order. What followed became known as the Carandiru Massacre. Officers stormed the prison complex, and by the end of the operation, 111 inmates were dead. Most were killed by gunfire. Investigations later revealed that many of the prisoners had been unarmed. The scale of the violence shocked Brazil and drew international condemnation. Human rights organizations questioned whether the use of force had been proportionate or necessary. The massacre exposed deep systemic failures, overcrowding, lack of oversight, and a reliance on militarized responses rather than reform. In the years that followed, Carandiru became a symbol of everything that could go wrong within a prison system: neglect, mismanagement, and explosive violence. Legal battles over accountability continued for decades, with convictions and reversals of police officers involved. Ultimately, the prison was demolished in 2002. Its destruction was intended to signal a break from a troubled past, yet Carandiru remains a case study in how structural neglect can create conditions where tragedy becomes almost inevitable. It demonstrated that inhumane conditions are not always the result of deliberate torture, but sometimes the consequence of overcrowding, indifference, and systemic collapse. In the aftermath of the 1994 Rwandan genocide, the country faced an unprecedented crisis. Nearly 1 million people had been killed in a span of about 100 days. When the violence ended, tens of thousands of suspected participants were arrested.
Rwanda's judicial and prison systems were suddenly overwhelmed. Gitarama Prison became one of the most extreme examples of that collapse. Originally designed to hold roughly 400 inmates, the prison's population surged into the thousands within a short period. Reports from the late 1990s estimated that more than 6,000 prisoners were crammed into the facility at one time. The overcrowding was so severe that many inmates were forced to stand for most of the day and even sleep upright, pressed tightly against one another due to lack of floor space. Sanitation deteriorated rapidly. With limited access to clean water and insufficient toilet facilities, waste accumulated in confined areas. Infectious diseases spread quickly through the population. Medical care was scarce, and malnutrition became common as food supplies struggled to meet demand. In some accounts, prisoners developed severe infections in their feet and legs from constant standing in unsanitary conditions. Many detainees had not yet been formally tried. Rwanda's legal infrastructure had been devastated during the genocide, leaving courts understaffed and records destroyed. As a result, thousands of suspects waited years for their cases to be heard. The delay created a situation where individuals were confined under extreme conditions without timely judicial resolution. International observers and human rights organizations documented the conditions, describing them as inhumane and unsustainable. However, the Rwandan government argued that the crisis was unprecedented and that the scale of arrests reflected the magnitude of the crimes committed. In response to the backlog, Rwanda eventually implemented the Gakaka court system, a community-based justice process intended to accelerate trials and reduce prison populations. Gitarama Prison illustrates how inhumanity can emerge not only from deliberate cruelty, but from systemic overload. When institutions collapse under extraordinary pressure, confinement can transform into suffering on a massive scale. It stands as a reminder that justice systems, when overwhelmed, can unintentionally produce conditions as harsh as those created by design.
Opened in 1994 in the mountains of Colorado, ADX Florence was designed as the United States' most secure federal prison. Often referred to as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, it represents the modern evolution of extreme incarceration, where control is achieved not through physical brutality, but through near-total isolation. ADX is a supermax facility built specifically to house inmates considered too dangerous or disruptive for other prisons. This includes convicted terrorists, high-ranking gang leaders, and individuals who committed violence against other inmates or staff while already incarcerated. The architecture itself reflects the philosophy: concrete, steel, controlled light, and minimal human contact. Prisoners at ADX Florence spend approximately 23 hours a day alone in single-occupancy cells measuring about 7 by 12 feet. The cells are constructed of reinforced concrete, including the bed and desk. Windows are narrow slits designed to prevent inmates from seeing the surrounding landscape. They allow light in but restrict orientation. Meals are passed through slots in solid steel doors, eliminating face-to-face interaction. Human contact is extremely limited. Conversations with other prisoners are nearly impossible due to the design of the cell blocks. Recreation, when permitted, typically occurs alone in small enclosed areas, sometimes described as concrete pens. Even medical and legal visits are tightly controlled and monitored. Critics, including human rights advocates and psychologists, have raised concerns about the effects of prolonged solitary confinement. Studies have linked extended isolation to anxiety, depression, hallucinations, and cognitive decline. Lawsuits have challenged the conditions at the facility, particularly regarding inmates with pre-existing mental illness.
In response, the Bureau of Prisons has made adjustments over time, including step-down programs intended to transition some prisoners out of the most restrictive units. ADX Florence reflects a broader shift in late 20th century penal policy toward maximum security and risk management. Unlike historical prisons that relied on public spectacle or forced labor, ADX operates on sensory deprivation and controlled routine. It demonstrates how modern incarceration can produce extreme conditions not through visible violence, but through the systematic removal of social interaction, turning isolation itself into the primary instrument of punishment.
For years, La Sabaneta prison in Maracaibo was considered one of the most violent detention centers in Latin America. Unlike highly controlled facilities built on strict discipline, La Sabaneta became notorious for the opposite reason, the near-total collapse of internal authority. What emerged inside its walls was not order, but a parallel system governed largely by inmates themselves. Originally constructed to house a far smaller population, the prison quickly became overcrowded. Thousands of inmates were confined in deteriorating buildings with limited sanitation, unreliable electricity, and insufficient medical care. Over time, official supervision weakened. Guards reportedly maintained control of the perimeter, but internal organization, including housing assignments, security, and the distribution of goods, often fell to prisoner-led gangs known locally as pranes. Weapons, including firearms and grenades, were smuggled into the facility. Armed groups established dominance over different cell blocks, collecting payments from other inmates in exchange for protection. Violence was frequent and often deadly. Clashes between rival factions resulted in riots that left dozens dead over the years. One of the most significant incidents occurred in 2013, when a large-scale riot and military intervention led to numerous casualties. The event drew international attention and intensified scrutiny of Venezuela's prison system. Human rights organizations described conditions as chaotic and dangerously neglected, pointing to systemic corruption, overcrowding, and lack of reform. Daily life inside La Sabaneta could depend entirely on an inmate's ability to align with powerful groups. Those without protection were especially vulnerable. Access to food, sleeping space, and even basic safety often required negotiation within this informal hierarchy. The absence of consistent state control meant that incarceration did not guarantee structure. It created an environment where violence operated with minimal restraint. La Sabaneta ultimately closed in 2013 following repeated scandals and deadly unrest. Its history demonstrates a different kind of inhumanity, one born not from strict regimentation, but from abandonment. When the state fails to maintain lawful order within prison walls, confinement can devolve into survival within a lawless micro-society, where power determines fate more than justice ever could.